Episode 9, August the 17th to the 22nd, 1914. My Road to Adventure, by Captain Arnold Gyde. Read by David Kellam. After about 2 days' stay, the battalion moved away from the rest camp, and setting out before dawn, marched back through those fatal streets of Havre, this time deserted in the moonlight, to a sort of shed, called by the French authorities a troop station. Here, as usual, the train was waiting, and the men had to be put in. The carriages could not be called luxurious. To be frank, they were cattle trucks, but it takes more than that to dampen the spirits of Mr. Thomas Atkins. Cries imitating the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep broke out from their ranks. The train chugged out of the depot and wended its way in the most casual manner through the streets of Havre. This so amazed Tommy that he roared with laughter. The people who rushed to give the train a send-off with many cries of "Vive les Anglais" and "A bas les Boches" were greeted with more bleatings and brayings. The journey through France was quite uneventful. Sleeping or reading the whole day through, the subaltern only remembered Rouen, passed at about midday, and Amiens later in the evening. The train had paused at numerous villages on its way, and in every case there had been violent demonstrations of enthusiasm. In one case, a young lady of prepossessing appearance had thrust her face through the window and talked very excitedly and quite incomprehensibly, until one of the fellows in the carriage grasped the situation, leant forward, and did honour to the occasion. The damsel retired blushing. At Amiens, various rumours were afloat. Somebody had heard the colonel say the magic word Liège. Pictures of battles to be fought that very night thrilled some of them not a little. Dawn found the battalion hungry, shivering, and miserable, paraded by the side of the track at a little wayside station called Wassigny. The train shunted away, leaving the battalion with a positive feeling of desolation. A staff officer, rubbing sleep from his eyes, emerged from a little estaminet, and gave the colonel the necessary orders. During the march that ensued, the battalion passed through villages where the 3 other regiments in the brigade were billeted. At length, a village called Iron was reached, and their various billets were allocated to each company. The subaltern's company settled down in a huge watermill, its officers being quartered in the miller's private house. A wash, a shave, and a meal worked wonders. And so the journey was finished, and the battalion found itself at length in the theatre of operations. The battalions which composed the 1st Expeditionary Force had been spread in small groups over the whole length and breadth of Britain. They had been mobilized, embarked, piloted across the Channel in the face of an undefeated enemy fleet, rested and trained to their various areas of concentration, to take their place by the side of their French allies. All this was accomplished without a single hitch, and with a speed that was astonishing. Peace reigned for the next 5 days, and the last taste of careless days that so many of those poor fellows were to have. A route march generally occupied the mornings, and a musketry parade the evenings. Meanwhile, the men were rapidly accustoming themselves to the new conditions. The officers occupied themselves with polishing up their French, and getting a hold upon the reservists who had joined the battalion on mobilization. The French did everything in their power to make the battalion at home. Cider was given to the men in buckets. The officers were treated like the best friends of the families with whom they were billeted. The fatted calf was not spared, and this in a land where there were not too many fatted calves. The company struck a particularly soft spot. The miller had gone to the war, leaving behind him his wife, his mother, and 2 children. Nothing they could do for the 5 officers of the company was too much trouble. Madame Maire resigned her bedroom to the major and his second-in-command, while Madame herself slew the fattest of her chickens for the meal of her hungry officers. The talk that was indulged in must have been interesting, even though the French was halting and ungrammatical. Of all the company's messes, this one took the most serious view of the future, and earned the name Les Miserables. The senior subaltern said that his calm preceded a storm. The papers they got, Le Petit Parisien and such like, talked vaguely of a successful offensive on the extreme right. Mulhouse, it was said, had been taken, but of the left of Belgium there was silence. Such ideas as the subaltern himself had on the strategic situation were but crude. The line of battle he fancied would stretch north and south from Mulhouse to Liège. If it were true that Liège had fallen, he thought the left would rest successfully on Namur. The English army, he imagined, was acting as general reserve behind the French line, and would not be employed until the time had arrived to hurl the last reserve into the melee, at the most critical point. And all the while, never a sound of firing, never a sight of the red and blue of the French uniforms. The war might have been 200 miles away. Meanwhile, Tommy on his marches was discovering things. Wonder of wonders, this curious people called baccy, tabac, and if you wants a bit of bread, you asks for pain. Struth. He loved to hear the French gabble to him in their excited way. He never thought that reciprocally his talk was just as funny. The French matches earned unprintable names, but on the whole he admired sunny France, with its squares of golden corn and vegetables. And when he passed a painted crucifix with its cluster of flowering graves, he would say, "Golly, Bill, ain't it pretty? We ought to have them at home, you know." And of course, he kept on saying what he was going to do with Kaiser Bill. One night, the men of the company gave a little concert outside the mill. The flower-scented twilight was fragrantly beautiful, and the mill stream gurgled a lullaby accompaniment as it swept past the trailing grass. Nor was there any lack of talent. One reservist, a minor since he had left the army, roared out several songs concerning the feminine element at the seaside, or voicing an inquiry as to a gentleman's companion on the previous night. Then, with an entire lack of appropriateness, another got up and recited The Wreck of the Titanic in a most touching and dramatic manner. Followed a song with a much appreciated chorus. Though your heart may ache a while, never mind. Though your face may lose its smile, never mind. For there's sunshine after rain, and then gladness follows pain. You'll be happy once again, never mind. The ditty deals with broken vows and faithless hearts and blighted lives, just the sort of song that Tommy loves to warble after a good meal in the evening. It conjured up to the subaltern's eyes the picture of the dainty little star who had sung it on the boards of the Colosseum. And to conclude, Madame's voice, French and sonorously metallic, was heard in the dining room, striking up the Marseillaise. Tommy didn't know a word of it, but he yelled, "March on," a very good translation of Marchons, and sang La La to the rest of the tune. Thus passed peacefully through those 5 days, the calm before the storm. The battalion had arrived at Iron on a Sunday morning. It had rested there while the remainder of the British Army was being concentrated, until Friday morning. On Thursday night, the battalion orders made it clear that a start was to be made. Parade was to be earlier than usual, and nothing was to be left behind. Everyone was very sorry to be leaving their French friends, and there were great doings that night. Champagne was produced, and a horrible sort of liquor called alcohol was introduced into the coffee. Such was the generosity of the miller's people that it was only with the greatest difficulty that the captain induced Madame to accept any payment for her kindness. And so, in the chill of that Friday morning, the battalion marched away, not without many handshakings and blessings from the simple villagers. The subaltern often wonders what became of Madame, and that excitable son Raoul, and the charming Teresa, whom the subalterns had all insisted on kissing before they left. The battalion joined its brigade, and the brigade its division, and before the sun was very high in the sky, they were swinging along the Route Nationale, due northwards. The day was very hot, and the battalion was hurried, with as short halts as possible towards Landrecies. As, however, this march was easily surpassed in frightfulness by many others, it will be enough to say that Landrecies was reached in the afternoon. Having seen these men as comfortable as possible in the schools where they were billeted for the night, the subaltern threw off his equipment, and having bought as much chocolate as he and a friend could lay their hands on, retired to his room and lay down. At about 7 o'clock in the evening, the 3 subalterns made their way to the largest hotel in the town, where they found the rest of the mess already assembled at dinner. He often remembered this meal afterwards, for it was the last he had properly served for some time. In the middle of it, the colonel was summoned hastily away by an urgent message, and before they dispersed to their billets, the unwelcome news was received that battalion parade was to be at 3 o'clock next morning. "This," said he, "is the real beginning of the show. Henceforth, horribleness." A hunk of bread eaten during the first stage of the march was all the breakfast he could find. Mariol, a suburb of Landrecies, was passed, and an hour later a big railway junction. The march seemed to be directed on Maubeuge, but a digression was made to the northwest, and finally a halt was called at a tiny village called Hargins. The subaltern's men were billeted in a large barn opening onto an orchard. After a scrap meal, he pulled out some maps to study the country which lay before them, and what should meet his eye but the field of Waterloo, with all its familiar names: Charleroi, Ligny, Quatre-Bras, Genappe, the names which he had studied a year ago at Sandhurst. Surely these names of the victory of 99 years ago were a good omen. A horrible rumour went about that another move was to be made at 5 o'clock the same evening, but this hour was subsequently altered to 2 o'clock the next morning. That night, a 5-franc postal order was given to every man as part of his pay. Even in the height of summer, there's always a feeling of ghostliness about nocturnal parades. The darkness was intense. As might be expected, the men had not by any means recovered from the heat and exertion of the previous day, and were not in the best of tempers. The subaltern himself was so tired that he had to lie down on the cold road at each hourly halt of 10 minutes, and, with his cap for a pillow, slept soundly for at least 8 of those minutes. Then whistles were sounded ahead. The men would rise wearily and shuffle on their equipment with a single effort that is the hallmark of a well-trained soldier. The captain, passing along the company, called his attention to the village they were passing. It was Malplaquet. The grey light of dawn revealed large open fields. "I expect this is where they fought it out," said the captain. Keeping a close eye on the map, he could tell almost to 100 yards where the boundary of Belgium crossed the road. A few miles further, a halt for breakfast was ordered, and it was about 8 o'clock. The colonel called for company commanders, and while they were away, Sir John French, followed by Sir Archibald Murray, and a few members of the general staff, passed by in motors. Amongst the 101 pictures that the subaltern will always carry in his mind of the opening stages of the campaign, this one stands out most vividly. The sun was shining, but it was still cool. On the right of the road was a thick forest of young firs. On the left, a row of essentially suburban villas were being built, curiously out of place in their agricultural district. The men were sitting on the banks of the road or clustered around the cookers, drawing their breakfast rations of bread and cold bacon. Then the major came back. There was an expression on his face that showed he was well aware of the dramatic part he was about to play. Imagine him standing by the wayside, surrounded by his officers, 2 sergeant majors, and some 6 senior sergeants, all with their pencils ready poised to write his orders in their field service notebooks. There was a pause of several seconds. The major seemed to be at a loss, quite how to begin. "There's a lot that I needn't mention, but this is what concerns this company," he said with a jerk. When we reach... Here he mentioned a name which the subaltern has long since forgotten. We have to deploy to the left and search the village of Harmigny to drive the enemy from it and take up a position. It was a blow. Officers were frowning over their notebooks as if afraid they hadn't heard correctly. The enemy? Here? In the western corner of Belgium? The major's orders petered out. They saluted and returned to their platoons, feeling puzzled and a little shaken. The subaltern had come to this campaign with such fresh hopes of victory. This was not to have been a repetition of '70. France would not have gone to war unless she had been strong and ready. Inspired with the spirit of the First Republic, the French armies, they had told themselves, would surge forward in a wave of victory and beat successfully against the crumbling sands of the Kaiser's military monarchy. Victory, drenching Germany with the blood of her sons and adding a lustre to the sun of peace that should never be dimmed by the black clouds of militarism. And all this was not to be. He'd never even heard that Liège had fallen, let alone Brussels. And here were the Germans apparently right round the Allied flank. It was astounding, irritating. In a vague way he felt deceived and staggered. It was a disillusionment. If the Germans were across the Sambre, the French could scarcely launch their victorious attack on the Rhine. The excitement dispelled his fatigue, but the men were openly incredulous. "The ruddy Uhlans here already, and they're only telling us that to make us march." The first fight, how would it turn out? How would the men shape? Could the ammunition supply be depended upon? But above all, what would he be like? Would he feel afraid? If so, would he be able to hide it? Would his men follow him well? Perhaps he might be wounded. Parts of him shrank from the thought. Or killed. No, somehow he felt it was impossible that he would be killed. These and 1,000 more such questions flashed across his brain as the march continued northwards. The hourly halts were decreased from 10 to about 3 minutes. The excitement of the future dissolved, the accumulating fatigue of the 3 days, the very weight of his sword and haversack was forgotten. It was Sunday morning. The bells of the village churches were ringing, and the women and children, decked in their Sunday best, were going calmly to church, just as if the greatest battle that up to then history had ever seen were not about to be fought around their very homesteads. A waterworks was passed, and at last the crossroads were reached. It was a wait while the battalion in front of them deployed. Officers were loading their revolvers. They threw aside a hastily improvised barricade of ploughshares and hurried on to the village, which was to be their especial care in the impending battle, known, rather inadequately, as Mons.
From your